The movie opens with Mr. Snow meeting in private with a man named Mr. Straker, who give him instructions to get a vital item for him. In order to get a big crate for him, Mr. Straker instructed Snow to drive his truck to the port at 6 o'clock in the evening. After underscoring the crate's significance, he instructed him to deliver it to his new residence, Marston House. Mr. Snow arrived to the residence where he and his friend Hank were to deliver the package a little while later. Following Mr. Straker's instructions, they hoisted the crate together and carried it into the cellar. But when he got down there, the cellar was too dark and the crate was too heavy, so Hank stumbled on a piece of wood and dropped the crate, breaking it. Snow turned on the lights right away, and they saw that the crate was filled with dirt. Despite their horror at this finding, they chose to disregard it and carried on moving the cargo. When they were ready to go after dropping off the container, Snow heard a voice urging him to approach, but Hank talked him out of it, and they both departed. Ben Mears, meanwhile, was observing from the Marston residence. He was then startled by a policeman who questioned him why he was there. He said that he had lived there before and didn't intend to cause trouble, and the officer departed. Soon after, Ben went to a real estate firm to find a rental property. It was then that he met Susan, a woman who was reading his book and who took a fancy to him. He inquired about the Marston house after spotting someone there while out exploring. She informed him that the property was recently purchased by a European man, and his store is located directly across the street. An elderly woman gave Ben a tour of his new house that same day. She gave him all the information he needed regarding the location. Richie Bodden, who also happens to be a bully, approached Ralph, Danny, and Mark as they were attempting a magic trick. Mark wasn't having any of that, so he pushed Richie to the ground and wouldn't let him go until Mr. Burke removed them. After giving him some advice, they all scattered. Straker was watching the kids from his shop, but they went their separate ways. Susan is pressuring her to wed the man she found for Ben as he is in the library studying murders that occurred on Salem's lot. Susan noticed Ben in the library as well when she turned to check behind her. The receptionist informing Susan and her mother about Ben's identity. She had a clear memory of him since 20 years prior near Hollowell Road. There had been a terrible collision in which both parents perished. But in a really chic way, Susan invited him to meet her tonight at the drive-in. When the kids got to Mark's house, it was full of frightening things. Then, since he is afraid of the dark and it is almost dark, Ralph proposed that they go home. In order to help calm his breathing, Mark then offered him a Houdini to blow on when he's terrified. Luckily for Susan, Ben showed up at the drive-in and greeted her. Just as Danny and Ralph were heading home, Mr. Straker drove up, approaching them. He met them and offered to give them a ride, but they refused and avoided him by going into the forest. Mark and Susan were perched on an anchor, looking down at all the automobiles. She told him her story when he asked her about it. He felt sorry for her, and it was a sad one. Then she questioned him about his return to Salem's lot, and he informed her that he was only here to conduct study. Danny and Ralph, meantime, were still traveling home when they heard a noise coming from behind them, but they chose to ignore it and continued on their journey. Suddenly, Ralph was abducted by Mr. Straker from earlier and placed in the trunk of his vehicle. In order to offer him as a sacrifice to his master, Barlow, the Lord of Flies, he pulled him into the Marston home. After every flame was extinguished, Ralph was coldly devoured by Master Barlow, who came outside to accept his tribute. After a week, the search team that had been looking for Ralph returned with no clues as to where he was. After the hunt, Ben took Susan home while her mother watched from the upper story. Denny blamed himself for Ralph's disappearance while he was in his room. Mark gave Ralph the Houdini, and then he heard someone playing it. After checking his window to see whether it was Ralph, Danny decided to go outside for a better look because the fog was thick everywhere. After attempting to locate the source of the sound, Danny noticed the Houdini on the ground, but he also felt something slinking up his back. Something grabbed him from above as he turned around and started walking in that direction. When Danny's mother took him to the hospital the following day, they determined that he had pernicious anemia, a disorder in which the body is unable to produce blood quickly enough. When Danny told his mother he was thirsty when he woke up in the middle of the night, she hurried outside to get the nurse and get him some water. She yelled in pain as she returned, but he had already begun to consume the blood that was being given to him. Ben was present as the entire community came together for Danny's funeral the following day. The undertaker slept off during the event. However, he awoke later that evening and buried Danny's coffin. He was laying sands at the ground. He started to hear cries for assistance coming from inside the casket as he was doing this. He was so horrified that he opened the coffin and discovered Mark dead. Unaware that Mark was already outside, he closed it and carried out the funeral. When he saw the coffin open, he wanted to carry on with the burial. Then Danny came from behind him and ate him. After teaching at the school, Mr. Burke went to a bar to decompress. He then went up to the undertaker from the funeral. When Burke questioned him why he didn't seem so good, he explained that he hadn't been feeling well since the funeral and that he was afraid to return home. Burke then extended an invitation for him to spend the night with him. Burke asked him how he acquired the bite marks on his neck, but he spotted the blood right away. It made him feel something. A knock on Mr. Burke's front door interrupted him as he was going downstairs to take his pipe. He noticed the individual climbing onto his window as he headed outside to see who was knocking. Mr. Burke went right away to Ben's house to greet him. After requesting a medallion or crucifix of some type from Ben, he demanded that they accompany him to his home. When he brought them to the chamber where he kept the undertaker, he saw that the marks on his neck had disappeared and that his body was now cold. They contacted a police constable to see how he was doing because they were all smart and thought he was a vampire. When Mark heard noises coming from the window when he was sound sleeping in his bed that night, he turned to see it was Danny. After Mark put on his spectacles and seen Danny begging him to allow him in, he moved cautiously to the window. When he made eye contact with Danny, he used mental coercion to open the window, even though he was initially hesitant to do so. When Danny flew into the window and announced that Master Barlow wanted to meet him, Mark instantly put the glowing cross on his desk on Danny's chin, which caused Flea to fly. Then Mark hurried to shut the window again and promised to release Danny. Without hesitation, he pulled out his books and began reading up on vampires. After marking out a few key words, he concluded that Danny would not be free unless he killed Barlow. Burke spent a good deal of time researching vampires so that he would be ready, but as he turned around, he discovered that the Undertaker had already changed into a vampire. He reprimanded him with the cross on his table. His crucifix was unrealistic, and he was attacked from behind as he carried it around his house to ensure the demonic vampire had left. Slowly, the vampire moved near him, but he managed to grab his crucifix and chastise him out of his home. A nurse arrived the following day to inform Danny's treating physician that his mother had been discovered deceased this morning. She hurried to the morgue to see if the Undertaker's body was still there after recalling what Burke had told her about vampires, but it had vanished. Burke got busted fairly badly after the doctor arrived at his house and saw that everything was messed up. She asked if he had any idea what was happening and told him about the death and the missing body from the morgue. He informed her about the vampire deterrence as she was treating him, but she thought it was all a made-up superstition. To the same time, Mark showed up to the Marston residence holding a stick. He went straight into the cellar after first opening it. Burke was in there too, and he asked him out while he was searching for Barlow. Straker locked them inside while they were talking after Mark informed him that Barlow was a vampire and that he had Danny because it was so gloomy inside. Burke ignited the candles. Then, as they searched for another escape route, he pulled Mark close. It was too late when Burke took Mike upstairs. Barlow had been feeding on Burke when Straker opened the door and carried Mark. Ben spent the night at the morgue with Susan and the doctor, keeping a close eye on Mark's mother's lifeless body to see if there would be any reactions. They were all frightened as her body began to move. In order to chastise the vampire, they took chopsticks and fashioned them into a cross. The cross glowed as they began to pray, but then it cracked and the vampire leapt on the doctor, biting her in the process. The vampire ran away when Susan reassembled the cross and put it on her back. Following the punishment, they found that the vampire had been bitten, and in order to prevent the bite from spreading, they administered a rabies vaccination to her. The following day, they made the decision to obtain sacred objects from the church authorities. At the Marston house, Mark was hanged upside down, and when he struggled to get free, he dropped. It was Straker who entered the loving room. Then Mark killed him by knocking him out from behind. The priest didn't believe Ben, Susan, and the doctor when they went to the church to inform him about the vampires who were tearing through their town. He thought they were lying. Mark stormed into the church as they were talking, and they were shocked to see him. He explained to them that Burke had changed and was now one of them. Everyone followed Mark to the Marston residence where they entered. Despite searching the entire room, they were unable to locate Straker's body. Ben used a torchlight to investigate the door that suddenly opened tightly in front of them and found that there were no stairs. After a while, they descended using a ladder and began looking for the vampires. Then they began to hear an odd sound, but they were unable to determine its source. Burke was steadily catching up to Ben and drawing him closer. Burke was then set on fire as the priest blew open the cellar door. Then, this time, Ben stabbed him in the heart. After they left, Mark informed them that Barlow would be visiting his parents tonight, so they needed to come up with a way to keep everyone safe. In order to survive the night, the priest advised them to all tell their family members to seek refuge in the church. Susan immediately returned home to alert her mother to the impending threat to the community. However, a vampire quickly dragged her out of the house after emerging from hiding and biting her. The priest at Mark's house was attempting to persuade Mark's father to accompany them to church, but he refused to go. At that moment, they heard a creeping sound, and Mark's father went to investigate. Barlow appeared from behind and began feeding on his mother as the priest's cross began to glow. When the priest's attempt to chastise Barlow with his cross failed, Mark's father exploded, bleeding from the inside out. The priest's crucifix started to fade out as Mark dashed outdoors. Because of his lack of trust, it gave Barlow the chance to eat him up. But Mark was already encircled by vampires as he dashed into the woods and ascended his treehouse. Mark sat there feeling alone and afraid after locking all the windows in the treehouse. Ben took Susan to the doctor and drove her to the church so the doctor could give her the rabies injection, but it was too late because Susan had already begun to change. Ben chased after Susan after she stormed out of the church, but she had already left. A group of ravenous vampires surrounded Ben, so he fled back to the church. After locking the doors, they both entered. The sheriff's body was thrown inside by the vampires while they were inside. When Ben and the doctor visited Mark's house the following day, they discovered a note that Mark had left stating that he intended to murder Barlow. Holding a stick, Mark broke into Straker's store. When Mark attempted to attack him, he struck him with the stick. At Straker's shop, Ben and the doctor found Mark and wanted to take him and flee. But because Barlow killed his parents, he demanded that they fight back. Since they believed that all of the vampires sought refuge at the drive-in, the three of them proceeded there. After that, Ben opened one of the trunks and discovered Susan lying inside. The doctor then took Mark's stake and attempted to murder her. Ben and Mark fled for their life after Susan's mother shot the doctor and continued to shoot. As night fell, every vampire unlocked their trunk and began emerging. After a while, they surrounded Ben and nearly bit him. However, Mark was wise enough to drive past the board that was obstructing the sun, and when it dropped, every vampire inside its path was burned to death. After Susan's mother continued shooting at them, Mark rammed her to the ground with the same car, killing her. Ben pulled the coffin off of the truck and attempted to open it after spotting one where they thought Barlow would be hiding, but it was too heavy. They were running out of time, and night was slowly coming. They fled inside the adjacent barn to seek refuge after Barlow exploded the casket. Ben pulled Mark outside the bar so Susan couldn't get to him after she attacked him inside. As soon as Mark stood up, he ran after seeing Barlow standing atop a roof. Ben tumbled Susan and eventually staked her when she nearly died. Mark began turning on the lights of the automobiles in the garage where he was hiding. When Barlow began to rush in from above, he eventually got Mark and attempted to eat him, but Ben saved him by staking him through the mouth and then in his heart. They both drove off once Mark crawled out of the garage. At that point, the movie ended. To ensure you never miss any updates on new videos, kindly click the bell icon, subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.